When thinking of Skyrim's magic, do you think of the Restoration School? Combat, at least offensively, is covered by destruction and conjuration. Illusions is split between affecting you or your opponent for an advantage, and Alteration's most useful spells, at least consistently, are arguably its flesh spells, which serve as a defense buff, similar to Illusion's self-apply spells. So then, what does Restoration have going for it? Well, to find that out, just like all the other schools, you have to look at the spells themselves. Before talking about the spells, I feel like it's important to talk about the definition Skyrim assigns to Restoration. And when you go into the skill tree, underneath Restoration, it says, the School of Restoration involves control over life forces. And that's the first line. I'll stop there to mention, I feel like this applies to all except for one class of spells that I'll get into later, and not involving DLC. It continues by saying, this skill makes it easier to cast spells like Healing, Turn Undead, and Magical Wards. So you'll notice a trend in all these spells, or just about all these spells, that they involve, healing, life, whatnot, and I'll go in more depth into that later. Should there be a spell that is strengthened later on in different versions of the spell, then I will mention the weakest one in depth so there's an understanding later on, and then when we get to the versions that are stronger than the original, I'll just talk about how it's different than the original since we already have an understanding of it. So beginning in Novice, Healing. Healing heals the caster 10 points per second and is a constant release, meaning you equip it on either your left hand or right hand and constantly hold the action button on that side, and it just constantly heals you while draining magicka. The second Novice spell, Lesser Ward. Increases armor rating by 40 points and creates a shield that negates up to 40 points of magical attacks. Pretty self-explanatory. Your defense is buffed, and it puts up a shield that blocks magic attacks strictly. If the 40-point cap on the shield is overturned, then the shield will break and you'll be stunned for a couple of seconds. Apprentice spells. Fast Healing. Just like Healing, it focuses on your HP regen, but rather than a constant flow, it is a use after charge. So you charge it, you hold down whatever action button it is that you require for a couple of seconds and then release. But to make up for that, the fact that it's not constant and takes a while, it gives 50 per cast rather than 10 per second. Healing Hands. It's healing, but rather than healing the caster constantly, it heals whoever the caster is aiming at. However, it does not work for undead, atronachs, or machines. Steadfast Ward. A stronger version of Lesser Ward. All the point values from Lesser Ward, they go from 40 to 60. Turn Lesser Undead. It causes undead up to level 6 to flee for 30 seconds. This is a spell that is a projectile, much like what you'd see in Destruction, where you charge in your hand and then shoot it at an undead. Adept spells. Close Wounds. It's a stronger version of Fast Healing, healing 100 rather than 50. Heal Other. It heals whoever the caster is facing or aiming at, much like Healing Hands, but rather than a constant, it behaves like Fast Healing, but for someone else. 75 points, but it does not affect undead, atronachs, or machines. Greater Ward. Greater Ward is a stronger version of Steadfast Ward. It goes from 60 points of defense to 80 on the shield and on your character. Turn Undead. It's a stronger version of Turn Lesser Undead. It goes from Undead level 6 for 30 seconds to Undead level 13 for 30 seconds. Repel Lesser Undead. It's a weaker version of Turn Undead, going from level 13 for 30 seconds to level 8 for 30 seconds. However, casts an arc that can hit multiple enemies rather than one. This was my personal use for Restoration XP growth, because you can hit multiple undead at once. Expert Spells. Grand Healing. Grand Healing is essentially a stronger version of Close Wounds, healing 200 rather than 100, but it also has an effect to heal nearby people. Turn Greater Undead. It's a stronger version of Turn Undead. Instead of level 13 for 30 seconds, it's level 21 for 30 seconds. Repel Undead. Strong version of Repel Lesser Undead. Level 8 for 30 seconds becomes level 16 for 30 seconds, and the arc is retained. Circle of Protection. It's a charge spell that creates a circle around the caster that causes undead up to level 20 to flee. Master Spells. Bane of the Undead. It's an area of effect spell with dual required charge up and sets undead up to level 30 on fire and causes them to flee for 30 seconds. If used in town or near people, it will cause a bounty. Guardian Circle. Creates a circle that causes level 35 undead and lower to flee while also healing the caster at 20 points per second while inside the circle. Bit of a disclaimer, the reason why I don't have the Guardian Circle spell, the Master level 1 in Restoration, is because the quest to get it is bugged. So if you plan on hitting level 100 Restoration and getting all the spells, make sure you look into it beforehand, because I didn't and I wasn't able to get it. So it's kind of buggy, but there are solutions online. They just didn't work for me when I tried. The first branch of perks in Restoration I like to talk about is the branch that every school of magic has. That's, novice through master and then just the school name following it. They'd all just exist to make it more realistic so that someone who is like level 20 restoration can't immediately cast spells of the master variety. So what they do is novice restoration is you cost novice restoration spells for half the magicka and so on and so forth until master. And since they have that perk, they can make master spells take enormous amounts of magicka so that normally you wouldn't be able to just cast it on your first go. You'd have to actually reach 100 restoration to then half it so you could realistically cast it. So those exist for, role play purposes, and I think those are important for all the schools of magic, and they're fun. The left branch of Restoration skill tree holds one perk called Respite. It says healing spells also restore stamina. This adds a whole new level to it so that you're draining magicka, but also gaining stamina and health, and it doesn't decrease the amount of health you're gaining either. It just also adds stamina to that value. The central left branch includes Regeneration, which reads healing spells cure 50% more, which just means they heal 50% more, so the healing spell itself would go from healing 10 health per second to 15. Past that is Necromage, which reads all spells are more effective against undead. Originally, I thought this would boost the level cap on turn undead spells, but they don't, at least not according to the spell tab. They all remain level 6, that becomes level 6, level 8 stays level 8, all that. However, through testing, destruction spells deal more damage to undead, so I guess that affects all spells as it reads. So maybe illusion spells, affect high level undead, stuff like that. There's also a well-known, I don't know if it's an exploit, but if you play as a vampire and use Necromage, then when you heal yourself, you do 25% more healing since you're considered undead, and, it buffs against spells against undead, so, yeah. The central branch, aside from the novice to master restoration perks, has one perk called Ward Absorb, which reads wards recharge your magicka when hit with spells. This would be useful against mages, but it's situational, so keep that in mind. The second branch from the right has two perks. The first one is called Recovery with 2 tiers. The first tier reads magicka regenerates 25% faster, and the second tier is magicka regenerates 50% faster. I like this one because I think it's the opposite of Restoration's problem, which is that it's too specific and it's not useful in all situations, but magicka regen is just good, in general if you're doing magic playthrough. The second perk, Avoid Death. Once a day, heals 250 points automatically if you fall below 10% health. I can't think of a situation this isn't useful in. Just saving yourself from dying is a really good thing at all, and I think this fully encompasses what Restoration is about, which is the protection of life. Finally, the far right branch of Restoration has one perk titled Restoration Dualcasting. Its description reads, dualcasting a restoration spell overcharges the effects into an even more powerful version. This is a perk that's included in every school of magic in Skyrim. However, for Restoration, I find it particularly useful because you're able to squeeze healing out faster, which is very important in fights and combat. The point of all these comparisons is to show just how distant Restoration is in purpose from the others, because, I think it's the only one that really has a purpose, but that also affects it in a gameplay perspective, because Restoration, I personally feel the strongest use is its healing spells, and you only need to heal if you take damage, so one of the best ways to avoid taking damage, instead of just replenishing it, is to just deal more damage. And I feel like most people agree with that, so a lot of them start to just look for damage-dealing magic types. And why use a restoration spell that only affects undead when you could use a destruction spell that affects everything, including undead? So Restoration's purpose, is interesting to talk about, but from a gameplay perspective, it really just lowers its value. Well, obviously, what I feel the most interesting about Restoration is the philosophy. I also haven't really gone too deep into what my interpretation of the philosophy is, because sure, in the skill tree description, it says it's the school of life and all that, but that can be interpreted in so many ways. You could really say anything that protects you is the circle of life because it's defending you, whatever. But my interpretation is that it follows the cycle of life, birth, life, then death. That's why it's not heal undead, even though it's a DLC spell, but I'm act like it doesn't exist because I also feel it goes against Restoration's meaning. That's why it's turn undead or like set undead on fire and things like that rather than like heal undead, because they aren't supposed to go back to life. That goes against the cycle of life. They're dead and they are to remain dead because that's what life has decided. And restoration takes a stance hard with that. And healing yourself, you haven't exactly died yet. So healing yourself, that's just keeping you in life. While it may kind of go against like, your injuries or whatever the world says, like maybe you could say like, oh, well, you should be dying and restoration is healing you to prevent that. You're still alive. You haven't crossed that barrier yet, and restoration acknowledges that, and it's fine with helping you stay alive and increasing the life force you have. But once you've crossed that boundary, it doesn't let you come back. That's why all the spells are turn undead, and it's just it feels like a genuine hatred towards undead, because undead as a whole shouldn't exist in the eyes of life. If something is dead, it shouldn't be alive, which is literally what undead is. Like Draugr, they shouldn't be moving. They shouldn't be reanimated. They shouldn't be able to do anything, at least according to life. So that's why restoration has such a hard stance against undead and why it heals those that are still living. I think I had mentioned earlier that there was one type of spell inside of restoration that I didn't think agreed with the philosophy of restoration, and that spell genre is wards. I always felt that wards belong more in alteration because I think they don't really go with restoration's philosophy of like restoring or protecting life, because while it's still protecting your life, you could really say that about everything when it comes to like shields. Restoration's healing spells, that's like way closer to you. It's actually increasing your life force. But putting a shield in front of you, that just feels like alteration's flesh spells, which buff your defense. It's essentially the same thing except for magic. And while it hurts the philosophy, I think in a gameplay perspective, it helps restoration because it just gives you more spells to use and more situations where restoration might be considered. But wards also suffer from everything else restoration suffers from, which is the fact that they are reactionary. You can't use a ward spell against like a warrior. They just hit you through it. It only affects magical spells that attack you. So it still doesn't help in a gameplay perspective all that much, and it disagrees with the philosophy of restoration. Alteration is extremely broad when you look at just its name and even its spells. It doesn't really have a purpose behind the name other than the fact that it changes things. So you would think, oh, well, it changes things, there might be a reason behind it. But then when you look at the spells, it has a weird range to it. Like you can change ore into a different kind of ore, or give yourself the ability to breathe underwater, or buff your defense. So alteration, while it changes things, doesn't really have any reasoning behind it, at least not one that I can see through the gameplay, and there's none given in the skill tree description either. Aside from elemental advantages, destruction magic affects everything just about equally. So from a gameplay perspective, it doesn't look like it has any philosophy behind it. It doesn't really discriminate, doesn't go against anything specifically, like restoration does. And when you go to the skill tree, there's no further elaboration on what it does, like restorations. Restoration specifies it's the school of life, whereas destruction just says you can utilize things to deal damage. So destruction's more the caster's choice, while healing is very set in its ways and does something specific. Conjuration feels slightly more complicated in this regard because there's a big conversation around where the things are being conjured from, what's being conjured in the first place. But for gameplay, and really just everything that the character sees or the player sees, you're just conjuring an ally to help you in combat. There might be some times that they are used in a different way. None that I can even think of off the top of my head. I'm just giving more leniency. But most of the time, if not all the time, they're there purely for combat purposes, just like destruction. And once again, when you go to the skill tree description, it doesn't say anything about their reasonings for helping you. If there's any intentions or if like there's a purpose, they're just there because you summoned them for combat. Illusion is more similar to destruction and conjuration when it comes to how broad its effects are and what it affects, unlike restoration, as mentioned. But illusion starts off being unable to affect automatons, which makes sense because it focuses on changing the perception of those around you. Machines don't really have a brain, their opinions don't really exist even, so how would you change their opinions in the first place? Well, illusion even becomes able to do that. You can use invisibility and sneak past automatons after getting a certain perk. You can calm them, things like that. So illusion becomes even more broad and even distance itself further from restoration and the concept of it having a philosophy behind it. There's also none stated in the skill tree description of it either. After looking at the perks in illusion, I realize now that the automaton one also reads that it allows illusion to affect undead and daedra as well. I didn't notice that, but I'm gonna assume that's because they are like humans, because illusion focuses on changing people's perception. So undead and daedra are like humans, whereas machines are absolutely not humans in any type. So I still feel like machines are still the most discriminated against, if at all, and undead and daedra are only there because they're slightly different than humans, which illusion isn't really used to. To conclude, I think Restoration is the weakest school of magic from a gameplay perspective, although I think it is the most interesting to talk about because I do think it is the only one with an actual purpose or message behind it. And I think the fact that all the spells are niche kind of helped to show that because you can't really have spells that affect everything while also having it say it follows the message of life because you can't affect everything equally because life doesn't affect everything equally. There are things that are dead, there are things that are alive, and life takes a stance against those in some way or another. So I think Restoration is the only school of magic that has a genuine opinion and favor over some things over others, which makes it the most interesting.